Good evening. I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody here for tonight's special event. Everybody's focused on Egypt, everybody's focused on Libya, but we're still in a war in Afghanistan, and we're trying to get out of a war in Iraq. And these are still big stories. Tonight, our topic is Iraq. This is a subject really that's engaged the Baker Institute for almost from the beginning of the war. I have here a list of the events that we've sponsored since 2004. This is the 17th event at the Baker Institute on the subject of Iraq. And we've had a large number of distinguished diplomats, writers, and journalists. We're not only at the Baker Institute involved in trying to educate our students and the community on issues of Iraq, we've been involved in, on the fringes, I would say, of policy. You may remember the Iraq Study Group. Secretary Baker was co-chair with Lee Hamilton of that group. Ambassador Derigian was one of the two senior advisors of that group. They published this report in 2006, which I think made a significant contribution to the debate about Iraq at that time and improved the level of it. The conclusion of that report, or one of them, was that by the first quarter of 2008, the United States should be in a position to end combat operations and move to a support situation and let the Iraqis fight the war. They were 3 years premature. In 2009, President Obama took U.S. troops out of the cities, began to draw down the number of troops. On August 31st of 2010, he announced that Operation Iraqi Freedom was over. Our combat mission had ended. The remaining troops would train. They would be focused on terrorist operations, and they would protect American civilians in Iraq. He also said that at the end of this year, 2011, the military operation, the U.S. military operation in Iraq would end. One of the consequences of that was as the Defense Department withdraws, the role of the State Department is expanding. It becomes the most responsible agency in the government for Iraqi policy. And that is why we have as our speaker today, Michael Corbin. He's been a career Foreign Service officer. He graduated Swarthmore in 82. Went into the Peace Corps in Mauritania, and as he explained to our students just about 45 minutes ago, failed to revolutionize rice cultivation in that country. Nonetheless, he went into the Foreign Service. He learned Arabic and has had a remarkable number of posts in that region. In 85 to 87, he was in Tunisia. In 87 to 89, Kuwait. From 1994 to 1997, he was political and military affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. 2001 to 2003, he was the Deputy Director of the State Department Office of Arabic Peninsula Affairs. 2003 to 2006, he was back in Cairo. 2006 to 2007, he was a chargé d'affaires in Damascus. 2008 to 2009, he was counselor for political and military affairs in Baghdad. And since 2009, he's been the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Near East Affairs for Iraq issues. He's been on the ground, he's been in Washington, he's helping make the policy, and he is therefore superbly qualified to talk about his topic tonight, which is U.S. policy toward Iraq challenges and opportunities. Please welcome Mr. Corbin.
Thank you very much, and I'm honored and humbled at the same time to be the 17th person to come and speak on Iraq. What I would like to offer tonight is several things, and particularly I think as we look at events in the recent few days, weeks in the Middle East, an area that I know very well, I think that there's increasing importance for Iraq and for what we're doing there. And I'd like to lay out sort of where we are in Iraq and why it's important today and why it's particularly important given the news stories which I'm fixed on every time I'm not here because I'm seeing changes in the Middle East that I would never have predicted 6 months ago. So what I'd like to do tonight is leave time for lots of questions and have a discussion, but I'd like to focus on the two transitions that we in the US government are working on now in Iraq. The first one was already alluded to, is the conversion from a military mission in Iraq to a civilian-led non-military mission. And in the State Department, we're we feel an enormous weight on our shoulders to get this right. The Vice President has said this is the most significant civilian operation since the Marshall Plan. Since I work on this every day, I think this is actually true. I think that this is extremely important as we move from a security-dominated relationship where we had more than 165,000 US service people on the ground in Iraq to a civilian-led, embassy-led partnership with the Iraqi people where, as I like to say, instead of being 90% security and 10% everything else, it's going to be 10% security and 90% everything else. So that's the first transition I want to talk about, the military to civilian transition. And it has lots of lessons for me in the State Department as we look at how civilians can take over in conflict areas. And we have many conflict areas around the world where we would like to see civilians running the show and not the military running the show. So we have enormous weight or enormous focus on that transition. The second transition that I'd like to talk about is the transition the Iraqis are going through. And this is more dramatic in some ways than our transition. The Iraqis are leading their country from a period of isolation and economic sanctions that came about under the Saddam Hussein era to a partnership with their neighbors, to elections, to broad-based, inclusive government, and they're making enormous decisions that I will argue in our presentation are very significant, seeing what we are seeing going on around the rest of the region. So these two transitions are the sort of main focus of my talk, but I'd like to note that there are enormous challenges that we face in Iraq, and I want to address those, and I want to address at the end a little bit about the protests that we're seeing in Iraq and why they're different than some of the other protests around the region, but why they have enormous significance as we go forward. So let me dive right in and talk about the first transition, which is from a military-led operation and presence in Iraq to a civilian-led presence. We've already begun this this transition. I was in Iraq when our embassy, which is the largest in the world, opened in January of 2009 in Iraq. It's extremely important to have an embassy platform to conduct all of our civilian agency activities, to be able to receive Iraqis, to be able to issue visas, to have a commercial section, to do the normal things that we have when we have a strong bilateral partnership. When we were in one wing of the Republican Palace, which was a military camp, we couldn't do diplomacy as you normally do diplomacy. This military to civilian transition is something that I work 12 hours a day on because we owe so much to all those service people. When I said 165,000, we think of the service people who deployed to Iraq repeatedly, to the injuries, to the deaths, but also to the destruction to the families and the consequences that we're seeing around the country now of our military deployments to Iraq. At the State Department, we don't want to jeopardize what we've achieved in Iraq, and I'll explain what we think we've achieved in Iraq and where we think the possibilities are and where the challenges are. We've already begun the transition. The U.S. military moved out of the cities in June of 2009. The security agreement is in force, comes to an end at the end of this year. We're phasing out the military presence, and we're phasing in a civilian presence. We have something called the Strategic Framework Agreement, which is a broad bilateral partnership where we can focus on economics, on development, on education, on employment, the key things that Iraqis are seeking. And we have the possibility to do this because we have partners in Iraq who are pushing for this. They want to see the relationship expanded from just security to other areas, and they see the need for jobs, the need for services, the need for means to combat corruption by having good institutions, and we're fleshing out this Strategic Framework Agreement every day as we go forward. We're focusing on how our State Department and other civilian agency presence will be different from the military presence. Soldiers, combat soldiers on the ground in Iraq played an enormous role in the lives, everyday lives of Iraqi civilians. We will be playing a different role. What we will be doing is a traditional State Department role of engaging, monitoring, and managing programs where we will work with Iraqis around the country. We won't be everywhere where the U.S. military was, but we will have 2 consulates, one in Basra in the south, one in the very important Kurdish region in the north, in Erbil, and we'll have 2 branch offices along the Kurd-Arab fault line, which is very important. It's very expensive to staff these offices because, unlike everywhere else in the world where we can hire local employees to provide security, to cook meals, to do laundry, we're going to have to bring in contractors to do that. And this is already, for me, one of the big challenges that we have is convincing Congress to give us the money to do this important mission. But as I'll argue at the end of my speech tonight, I think it's particularly important that we stay the course in Iraq at this particular point. This partnership with the Iraqis is based on the fact that the Iraqis want us to take over in these areas where we've worked hard, but we haven't had the partnership because they haven't had the institutions. And this is extremely important as we look at the type of programs we're going to do. We're going to have a police development program which works on rule of law, which works on police training, which is different than the military training, which was focused on counterterrorism, which was getting policemen on the streets with AK-47s to counter terrorists. Now we need to teach human rights, community policing, human resources, all the things that we do in police training programs around the world where we have them and that are civilian-led. We've had great presence by the Treasury Department, by the Agriculture Department, by the Commerce Department. We're going to continue that presence, and we're going to engage the Iraqis on a broad spectrum of issues as we go forward. Now, how we do this partnership is a result of the fact of the enormous progress that the Iraqis have made themselves. When you think about what happened in Iraq since 1979, and I should perhaps start with the 1950s, in the 1950s, Iraq had the best universities in the region, the best hospitals in the region, the best artists. Iraqi painters, Iraqi singers were famous throughout the Middle East. Iraq was viewed as a cultural and educational center. Iraqis went to Egypt and other countries to help them. Now, what happened was the Ba'ath Party and various coups and rulers, culminating with Saddam Hussein, destroyed what Iraq had been. In 1979, the invasion of Iran. In 1990, the invasion of Kuwait. Terrorism against Jordan, Syria, Kuwait, and other countries were part and parcel of Saddam Hussein's regime that led to Iraq being isolated, not only from its neighbors, but from the rest of the world because of sanctions. In 2003, the invasion further upset what was going on in Iraq. And what we see now is the Iraqis have come through an enormous progression from 2003 to 2011. What we first saw was the sectarian and ethnic tensions bubble to the surface and result in almost all-out civil war in 2006, in ethnic cleansing, in violence against specific communities, in Sunnis fighting Shias, the Kurds defending themselves. Terrorist organizations, whether on the Shia extremist side or on the Sunni extremist side, took advantage of the situation. Militias were common. What we've seen happen since that time in 2006 when the country entered civil war is a gradual return from that. We've seen the Kurds decide that their future is in Baghdad, not in a separate independent Kurdistan. We've seen the political parties realize that there is something called an Iraqi nationality and run on platforms of addressing the civilian needs of the Iraqis. And we've seen the security situation vastly improve as we've gone forward. This transformation is extremely difficult for the Iraqis. The country was isolated after 1991, after the sanctions, after Saddam Hussein's forces were ejected from Kuwait. The sanctions were crushing on Iraq. What we've seen is that Iraq is reestablishing relations with all its neighbors, not just the US, but with Turkey, with Jordan, with Syria, with Kuwait. And this is going to be very important as Iraq tries to recreate that role it had in the 50s when it was a leader in the region. And the fact that, and this is where it becomes very important to look at what's going on in the rest of the region and what's going on in Iraq and sort of do a comparison, if you will. Iraq's had 3 national elections, which were viewed as free and fair, and had civil society organizations from both inside and outside the country help them organize. They've had provincial elections. They've formed a Council of Representatives, which is now on its second bunch of core members, Council of Representative members. Of the 325 that make up the current parliament or core, only 50 are returnees. We have decentralization in Iraq. We have the provinces where governors actually make resource decisions. And if you know the Middle East, whether it's Rabat or Cairo or Riyadh, most decisions are made in the capital. We see a great promise in the fact that the Iraqis are moving to a decentralized system where decisions are made locally by people who hold people responsible for the decisions that are made in their areas. As I've said, we've seen the Kurd-Arab dispute, which was the internal side of Saddam Hussein's face, where the Arabs were launched against the Kurds, and there were bloody wars and removal of populations. We've seen that change from being the top issue in terms of potential problems in Iraq to being the second issue. I would argue now that the top issue facing Iraq is corruption now, not the Arab-Kurd issue, because that 8-month-long period we went to get government formation led to the Iraqis choosing compromise over violence as a way forward. I had a lunch with 35 members of the Iraqi community here, and they had lots of concerns, but their major concerns were focused on corruption, and that gets to the provision of services, and it gets to how the government responds to the needs of the people. But we have in Iraq a civil society law that's the best in the region aside from Israel. It allows NGOs to be registered without being registered by the security services. It allows NGOs to receive foreign money without having controls on how they coordinate with foreigners. We have a media that has a lot of freedoms, and this is extremely important as we go forward. A free media is one of the key tools to defeat corruption. And in Iraq, although there have been moves against the media, so far the media remains much more free than in other areas. We have rule of law institutions where we've seen progress. The judges, for example, they've been able now to try terrorism trials. They're moving on to organized crime trials, and what we want to see them doing is corruption trials. We're seeing enormous challenges that remain from the refugee population that's still in Iraq, both internally displaced and externally displaced Iraqis. We see progress in the internally displaced populations as the government takes steps to address their situation and to compensate them for lost housing or to move them back to their housing that was taken over. Refugees are going to be a significant issue. I think refugees in Syria and Jordan were waiting to see the new government, to see whether it was an inclusive government, which it is. When you think of the alternatives that you could see in Iraq, a Shia government that neglected the interests of others, or a Shia Kurd government that ignored the Sunnis, or a Sunni Kurd government, you now have a government where everyone's represented. But that provides opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, you have everybody in the tent, so everyone's a part of all the decisions. But on the other hand, that means that every decision will be difficult. So as we go forward and we face the challenge of corruption and the challenge of resource distribution, you're going to have a government where everybody has to decide everything, and that's one of the things that we're grappling with. As we go forward, we're going to see the Iraqis take more steps into their own hands, and one of the ways that we see most important that I already alluded to is their relations with their neighbors. Iraq is going to establish balanced relations with its neighbors. It knows that Iran has enormous influence in Iraq, but it knows that Turkey has influence there. It wants to improve relations with Kuwait. It wants to improve relations with Syria. It seeks, most importantly, to see a better relationship with Saudi Arabia. This raises the question of Iranian influence in Iraq, for example. What we would argue is that while Iran has influence in Iraq because shared faith and economic interests and mere presence, in fact, the Iranian agenda in Iraq has not been enormously successful. The Shia blocs did not unite and run as all Shia against everyone else. There was an open list system that allowed candidates to run on their own names rather than as party lists. The Iranians were unable to defeat the security agreement that they put a lot of effort with the US. And what we see is that the Iraqis are successfully balancing relations with Iran and with Turkey. When you think of relations with Turkey, in the spring of 2008, Turkey sent tanks and land divisions across the border to invade northern Iraq to deal with the PKK threat. When you now look at relations between Turkey and Iraq, you see Turks receiving Masoud Barzani, the Kurdish leader in Ankara. You see Özçelik, the Turkish ambassador in Baghdad, being very involved, and Turkish leaders going to Ankara, Turkish leaders going to Baghdad, and Iraqi leaders going to Ankara. You see a real development in relations. Kuwait, which is now, it's the 20th anniversary of the liberation of Kuwait. Kuwait has the most to fear, potentially, from Iraq. We saw the Kuwaiti Prime Minister travel to Iraq in January, and Prime Minister Maliki traveled to Kuwait City just last week for discussions. This is going to be a tough issue for the Iraqis to address, but we see that they're making progress as they go forward. So let me wrap up so we can get to questions by talking about why this is relevant in the region, why it's important, what we're doing now in building this partnership. First of all, and I was just in Iraq 10 days ago for a brief visit, the Iraqis, as they seek to be reintegrated with the region, are now starting to say that they are being viewed as more positively by their Arab neighbors. For a long time, Iraq was viewed as, oh, if you try democracy, you have violence, and we don't want that democracy thing. Now Iraqis are being viewed as, well, you've done the democracy thing, and you are moving away from violence, you still have problems. There's a real opportunity for Iraq, which has enormous historic, sectarian, and ethnic conflicts and historical differences, to show how elections can be held, how institutions can be maintained and built up. But this will be a challenge as we go forward. The Iraqis themselves have protests going on right now. What I would point to is that these protests are about services, they're about corruption. We've had those protests for several years, and we'll continue to have them. They're not protests about regime change. They want to see the representatives and the government that they elected respond to their needs. And this is going to be critical as we go forward, that this government be representative. But Prime Minister Maliki received the most votes of any individual in the election that was held last year, and two blocs, which have secular parties. I would note another element of progress when you have these elections is that the Islamic extremists, whether on the Shia side or on the Sunni side, have done very badly. Those religious parties have done worse in every election that has been held. The Iraqi people are demonstrating for services, but there are people who will try and take advantage of these demonstrations. For example, the Sadrists, and Muqtada al-Sadr represents, he had the largest Shia militia, the Jaish al-Mahdi. He was briefly in Iraq, in Najaf, 3 weeks ago. He left, I would argue, because he's not as strong as some people would say in the United States. These people will try and take advantage of these demonstrations for their own interests or for the interests of other countries. We've also got to watch the extremists who continue to threaten the government in Iraq and everyone who will try and take advantage of what's going on there. There are enormous challenges ahead. I didn't mention the plight of minority communities, and I don't mean just the Christians, but the Yazidis and the Shabak. There are communities that have been taken advantage of by extremists on both sides and by some of the political forces in the country. We are working very hard to not associate ourselves too closely with the Christians, because that feeds into the extremist narrative that they're just hand in hand with the foreigners, but to support those communities every way we can without further putting them at risk. We want to see throughout the Middle East, but especially in Iraq, those Christian communities be able to thrive, and to see those Christians who fled Iraq to be able to go back to their communities there. As I said, corruption will be an enormous challenge, but if we have a free media, if we have a Council of Representatives, a parliament that will challenge the government and challenge ministers as it did last year, if we have judges who are willing to try these corruption cases, we see enormous potential for addressing this corruption issue that faces the rest of the Middle East. On the economic side, we've got to see job creation. Iraq, like many of the Middle Eastern countries, has a youth bulge. They have an oil sector where they've made decisions to bring in the international oil companies, but it's going to be at least 3 to 5 years before those oil reserves really come in online. And then oil does not provide a lot of employment. We have hope for the agriculture sector because Iraq, the place between the two rivers, Mesopotamia, has traditionally for 4,000 years had an enormously thriving agriculture sector. That could be an employer. We're also looking to see Iraqis from overseas who have technocratic background who left not necessarily after 2003, but during the 80s or during the 90s under different elements of Saddam's government or Iraqi isolation. We'd like to see the conditions in Iraq so they could return. As I've said, Iraq has lessons for the rest of the region. It also is different than the rest of the region. You can't compare Bahrain with Libya. When you look at events in Libya today, they're very different than Bahrain. Egypt was very different from Tunisia. Iraq is a very different country. But as we move forward, Iraq seems to us to offer certain hope of stability, and this is a very, it's got to be a very careful way we discuss it, but stability based on people who elected their own government and who continue to hold their government accountable. I'd like to stop here because I know there are probably lots of questions. I only covered 1/10 of the subjects I could have, but if there are questions, I would very much welcome them. And I'd like to acknowledge Ambassador Geridrian, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again, sir. Thank you. Yes.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Mine's more of a comment. It seems to me in both Iraq and Afghanistan, you have this problem of different groups that don't necessarily like each other. And it seems to me that rather than using the European government model, we would have been better off promoting the American federal system, which was set up to deal with this problem of different groups not necessarily liking each other. And so that I would think that in Iraq with the 18 or 19 provinces and different groups, had they gone to a federal system more like ours, they would have a better way going forward. And I think the same thing in Iraq.
No, I think that's a very interesting comment on how you deal with historic divisions, sectarian and ethnic divisions in a government that's trying to be responsive and accountable. What I would argue is that the way the Constitution was designed went actually a little bit further than federal, because it allowed the formation of autonomous regions, of which there is one autonomous region now, which is the independent Kurdistan region in the north. But any group of provinces, or even one province, can apply at any time to be an autonomous region. And in Basra, the Basra economic elite, the governor several years ago, pushed to make Basra a separate region. His people have decided that they'd rather be linked with Baghdad rather than separating away. what we see is that the Kurds have chosen their future in Baghdad, as I mentioned, not to set up a separate Kurdistan. And Masoud Barzani came down to Baghdad on November 11th to sign the final government formation deal that brought everyone together. So I take your point and agree with it, that you have to have ways of different groups addressing their needs. What's happened in Iraq is that the option has been this autonomous region, which is probably more drastic than a federal system. But as we go forward, we think that the Iraqis have put forward something called national identity, and we believe that the Iraqis have stepped away from civil war, and I think they will work together as we go forward and not in a federal system. Please.
No off the record.
As we move into this transition, what sorts of problems should we be looking at, should we be concerned about? What are we doing about them as you see the challenges that we'll be facing in the next year or two?
Well, at the State Department, what we're seeking to do is to be engaged in a civilian way around the country in Iraq so that we can monitor events. I didn't talk about human rights, which is extremely important. We can monitor the provision of services. We can support civil society and NGO groups that are formed. We think that a presence and engagement is extremely important, and that we have tools that we can use to address the challenges that Iraq faces. Some of those are from our U.S. Agency of International Development. Some of those are from our Department of Energy in helping Iraq to develop its oil resources in a sensible way. Department of Treasury, which has been on the ground for a long time in Iraq, is working closely with the Central Bank of Iraq and with the Ministry of Finance. There are tools that we have, and including NGO tools. We've had NDI and IRI, the two big political party NGOs that work overseas, have been very active in Iraq in supporting election observers and the formation of political parties. We see that during this transition period, and this is one of the things that we argue when we ask for the resources for Iraq, Iraq will have the oil resources that come online, but it's going to take some time. The infrastructure was destroyed, and it needs to be replaced. The international oil companies are already there. But during this 3 to 5 year period, we need to provide advice and technical expertise to the Iraqis. And we've got to be able to help them as they spend their own resources. They're getting out 2.5 million barrels a day now. It's still not the peak, which they had in 1979, which is 3.5 million barrels before Saddam Hussein invaded Iran after the Shah fell. But they're moving forward in that direction. We've got to help them spend their resources, but we need our help for this interim period so that they can take off and do it themselves. And we think they're making the right decisions. But as I said, this is an inclusive government, and things will take time. And already, somebody will, when I was having my discussion with the Iraqis at lunch today, somebody said, well, why has it taken 8 years and we haven't got electricity to the level where it should be in Iraq? Well, I mean, my first answer, we should have electricity at a better level in Iraq, but when the country went into just about civil war in 2006, it was impossible to do anything. In 2007, the surge to address those ethnic and sectarian tensions, the Sons of Iraq movement, which helped the Prime Minister Maliki going after the Sadrist militias in 2008 in Basra and then in Sadr City, all of that helped set the groundwork for what should have been the last 2.5 years of work on electricity, for example. It's been slow, it's been much slower, and that's why you see demonstrations in the streets. But I would note that in other cities, I was in Damascus for 2 years as head of our embassy. In the poorer suburbs of Damascus in the summer, you don't have electricity every day. You have certain numbers of hours that you're able to use. But Damascus is viewed as a paragon of stability. So I think that we have to do much more about electricity provision, and we'll work on that, but it'll take time.
You mentioned that the Kurdish leadership is committed to the, Iraqiness, or acknowledging the recognition of Baghdad as the center. Could you speak a little bit about how that has or hasn't played out in oil? Are the Kurds still saying that they're in charge of their own oil development and revenues? And how do you see that playing out over time and affecting the strength of having a three-way coalition?
Very good question, and I should always talk about oil since I'm in Houston, so we'll talk about hydrocarbons. It has played out, and there are specific examples. First of all, as the southern oil fields have come online, the Kurdish oil in the north has become less of a profitable and important asset for the Kurds, so they've been more inclined to negotiate. Then the central government has been more inclined to negotiate because they want the Kurds to be part of the central government and to work with them. So we've seen just in the last couple weeks some deals so that the Kurdish oil will be put into the northern pipeline to go out via Turkey. We've seen discussions between the Iraqi government and the Kurds on how to recognize all the contracts that the Kurds signed on their own oil. And we know that the hydrocarbons law, which has long been stalled, is something that is on the the Council of Representatives' agenda. Hydrocarbons are critical to the Kurds' ability to have the resources to deal with their issues. But we've also seen in the political area some compromises. The census, that the national census that the Kurds think is very important for determining Kurdish presence in formerly Arab areas, has been postponed because the Kurds were willing to do that so that they could give a time for a compromise to work. The first person named in the new government was Osama al-Nujayfi, who is a Sunni nationalist who has been at odds with the Kurds before. Athil Nujayfi, his brother, who's the governor of Nineveh province, has traveled several times and went the last time with Osama to the independent Kurdish region for discussions. We've seen progress in the provincial councils along the Arab-Kurd fault line that show evidence of compromise. Hydrocarbons is going to be an issue for everyone. It's not just the Kurds. It's an issue for those in Basra. It's an issue for those provinces that don't have oil. And how that commodity and the resources or the revenues from that commodity is divided transparently and equitably in a non-corrupt manner is one of the greatest challenges that we face going forward. And the government is going to have to put in mechanisms to show that that happens in a transparent manner. I just argue that the Ministry of Oil has shown that it's one of the least corrupt ministries in the Iraqi government, and the bid rounds, the international oil bid rounds that were held, were viewed by international observers as corruption-free. So there is a good position to start there, but the Iraqis are focused on who gets the oil revenue and how it's distributed, and that would be important.
Have the Kurds recognized the central government's right to be in the decision process for new oil contracts in Kurdistan?
Because they're engaging in, I won't say that what they've recognized or not, but I say they're engaged in intense negotiations to make this work. So if that's a de facto recognition, that's a de facto recognition. Please.
6 months before the downfall of Shah of Iran, Jimmy Carter visited the country and said the country is stable and stands on strong grounds, and it was gone. And one U.S. president or diplomats or one after another goes to Egypt, gone to Jordan, gone to Bahrain, all these, they say they are stable. And you see what's going on there. Iraq, if you go check their website on Facebook and all that, they're starting a revolution tomorrow. And here is their communique number one. And it's not jobs, and it's not unemployment. Revolution means you change the whole thing, the whole system. And you will start seeing that, more often. So why doesn't, like you, for instance, or any other, go out there to Tahrir Square tomorrow, and face those Iraqis, say, what do you want? And then you will know the truth. You cannot solve this problem, at the Center of Strategic and International Studies or here at James Baker Institute and elsewhere. And I would like you to address this. Same thing like what Jimmy Carter said. Shah of Iran is stable. But you will see starting tomorrow that literally they call it a revolution.
What they also call it a day of rage. There's obviously parallels that are being tried to be made between very different disturbances in countries from Bahrain to Libya to Egypt. What I would argue is that Iraq has already had its revolution, has already been extremely unstable. When they had the civil war in 2006 and 2007, everyone went back to their sex and their ethnic backgrounds, and they took up arms and they fought one another. Now what they've done is they've come back from that brink, and they've elected people, and they have formed a government which is not perfect by any means, and they want that government to address their needs. When some people call for revolution, what they're building on is popular unhappiness over the things I talked about. And we do talk to people in the streets in Baghdad about this all the time, or in other cities around the country. What will happen in terms of violence? What will happen in terms of unrest? Well, every country is different, and we're not about here to predict what's going on, but I would say that those who talk about a revolution are not talking about changing the system of government in Iraq. The Islamic extremists on the Shia side or the Islamic extremists on the Sunni side have tried that. Various people have tried to break Iraq into different sectors. Everyone has failed on that. Prime Minister Maliki and the government are taking dramatic measures to try and address the service needs of the people. We'll see if they're successful. But the option is that they can hold new elections, they can vote out the prime minister, and they can vote a new prime minister. As unpopular, a year ago, if you had said Prime Minister Maliki would be re-elected as prime minister, most people, observers, would say there's no way he could because he was so unpopular. He received the most votes in this March election that was certified as free and fair. So I don't want to argue about what the definition of revolution is, but what are the goals and objectives of this revolution? I would say they're feeding on popular discontent. There are 2 pages but they could be written in Libya, they could be written in anywhere that is having massive unrest. And the question is, what is going to change in Iraq? They can throw out their leader and have new parliamentary elections. What's changed in Iraq is that the different political parties have decided to participate in this system. We'll see how long that lasts. We see an opportunity for it to continue. We see Iraqis who say they're proud of of what they've accomplished. They've already almost had civil war or had civil war. They've pulled back from that. Certainly there will be people who will try and take advantage for foreign interests or domestic interests. But the question is, will they succeed? And we argue we don't see signs that they will. Please.
Actually, I'm from Iraq, and when I heard you talk about Iraq, I was thinking you are talking about different countries. To an extent, family in Iraq. The situation in Iraq is really still dangerous. There is a free media, but people, when they say their point of view, they get killed. And also judges, if they persecuted any official, they get killed. And doctors, they get kidnapped. I'm a professor in university, and I run away from Iraq. I mean, I can't go back to Iraq. I'm a professor and teacher. They cannot go back for Iraq. So I wish that I can see them the positive thing that you said about Iraq. And also people in Iraq, they have a revolution and they want to oust the regime. And even people in the southern Iraq, and there is people in the northern of Iraq. Because 2 Kurdish parties, they say that's the democracy. They've been dominated the political system since forever. They've been stayed there more than Saddam Hussein. And also we'll be talking about democracy. And by the way, I worked with the IRI. The United States of America spent a lot of money about democracy. And I don't see there is real democracy there. And we've been having an argument today about the priority, which makes me feel that we return back in the first square, because we've been arguing about priority. Is democracy priority or stability? And we've been talking about service, basic service, and you said because of decentralization, so Maliki he's not be able to take an action or decision because there is a democracy, serious. And there is really a lot of issue. And also I would like to mention something.
I have to start writing down all your questions because I have lots of comments.
About 2006, I've been in Iraq, and 2007, there was no sectarian, between Iraqis, between Sunni and Shia. The problem is when Paul Bremer constituted the Majlis al-Hukum, what's the name of the Council of the Governments? He established the governments upon the sectarian differences. I am Sunni, so I can be nominated. And this is one of the most fatal mistakes happened in Iraq, which led to the civil war. And also our border wasn't secure. So militia from Iraq, they can enter to Iraq.
From Iran and from Syria.
Because the border wasn't secure. And this is
okay, I agree with your last point, but let me just answer some of your comments because I'll lose track. First of all, absolutely, when the people who are living their daily lives on the streets of Iraq face enormous challenges, whether it's corruption, lack of electricity, fear of crime and kidnapping, absolutely. But I would argue, when I saw the bodies in the streets in 2006 and 2007, there was a lot of killing going on that isn't going on now. There was a lot of violence. I mean, you just look at the statistics, the ability of the Islamic extremists from either side to conduct massive attacks has changed completely. But let me focus on some specific things. First of all, on the Kurdish region, very interesting thing is developing in Kurdistan, which I will say, and I do agree, that the PDK and the PUK, the two big Kurdish parties, have had a monopoly for a long time. But when you look at the elections they had and a movement called Goran and other independent movements, in those elections, the two Kurdish parties established only got 53% of the vote. It's still a slight majority, but the other parties are entering into the fray there. When you look at what the different civil society organizations, the impact that they're having on life in Iraq, we see small steps in the right direction. We certainly don't see things getting worse than they were in 2006 and 2007. We do see threats of kidnapping, but as I said, the judges are beginning to address those. We've protected and we've worked on measures to protect judges so they can do terrorism trials and they can go after organized crime. I had a group of judges in my office just before Christmas, and they were focused on organized crime as their current mission, going after these gangs who claim to be supporting extremists but really are going after money. Then their next goal was to go after corruption. There are real Iraqis who are working for the system. There are real challenges in Iraq also. The electricity situation is still very bad. The unemployment situation is extremely bad. But when we talk about regime change in Iraq, it's not a question of what regime we're changing. It's a question of how can Iraqi everyday life for people get better. They have the possibility of having their oil resources come online. They have had elections so that they can have a decentralized system. They do have a parliament that does have effective means to block the prime minister and some of the things that he's decided in the past. They're on the way to a very difficult, as I said, very inefficient chance. Now, am I optimistic or pessimistic? I tend to be more optimistic because I've seen the changes. Is it going to get worse? It could get worse. But is there a chance that it's going to get better? We see that there's a chance that it's going to get better. When you look at where Iraq was and where it's come now, there's still enormous problems. When you talk about internally displaced people in the country, when you talk about the refugees who are still in Syria and Jordan, when you talk about the fact of corruption, you've got to have measures to address this, and they're not sufficient yet. But are they enough to have a revolution, and what would that revolution entail? I would argue that if foreign forces come in, or if one particular extremist group gets hold of enough impetus, then perhaps you would have some sort of major upset in Iraq. But different groups have tried that, and they've failed. So we don't see this happening. Right behind, two questions.
Yes, on what'll shake out here in Libya.
I'm staying away from Libya, and I just make a general comment that every country is different in the Middle East, and it's very dangerous to make assumptions that just because of what happened in Tunisia, something happened in Egypt, and because of what happened in Egypt, something in Libya happened, and then the results will be the same. Bahrain is, as I said, Bahrain is very different from Egypt, and Egypt is very different from Libya, and little Tunisia, which is right next door to Libya, where I've served twice, is very different from Libya. I think that different leaders have different responses, and the Secretary of State earlier today condemned the violence in Libya that appears to be being propagated by the Libyan government. We've seen defections from the Libyan government.
Well, you're giving a guess on Libya.
Wow. Having seen all these changes, I'm not going to make a guess. I can only hope that these revolutions will be positive and not negative. But I think there's no guarantee that when you throw away the old system, that you're going to necessarily end up with a better system. You're going to have a process, and you're going to have lots of different issues. Some will be peaceful, some won't, but it's going to be very difficult. I would predict for the next 5 years in the Middle East. That's a prediction on how difficult it is, not on how things are going to go. There's a question behind there, and then I'll come back here.
Yes, thank you. After the event in Tunisia and Egypt, actually, and after 8 years, I wonder, and the Iraqi people with me, wondering with me, why the United States didn't allow to make a peaceful change for the political system in Iraq, just like Tunisia and Egypt and currently in Libya. That will make Iraqi people avoid the whole tragedy and events, you know. And the second question, to be honest with you, I am worried about, as a professor in political science, I am worried about the incorrect social mobilization in Iraq, since elementary school until the higher education. And I am worried about the political development or the political modernization. It's happened incorrect in Iraq. Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are more comments rather than, I mean, I think we couldn't predict when Egypt was going to happen or Tunisia was going to happen, and I think that's just an illustration of how difficult it would be to go back to 2002 and predict when change would come in Iraq. So I'll stay away with that. I agree with you that we've lost teenagers. Education is just vitally important, and we're talking about programs to have job skills training so that these teenagers can get jobs. If they don't get jobs, we're going to just have more people unemployed, and we're going to have a bigger problem. But you're talking more about social mobilization and political development. I think that the development of non-governmental organizations in Iraq, I've met with many of them when I was in Iraq. I think it's very positive. Some of these are just websites with one person who calls himself an NGO. Some of them are just political fronts for political parties. Some of them are extremist jihadists who are very dangerous. But a great number of Iraqis want to participate in organizations which have a say in their life, and they're able to do that. They're under threat sometimes, but they are organizing, and I think this is a positive thing that we see in Iraq now. Please, question, or did you have one? Or?
Yeah. How could you say Iraq is much better off right now? And we know there's over 4 million refugees scattered all over the world. We know 75% of the Christians left Iraq. How could be better off? I don't understand. On what scale are you saying it's better off?
Basically, what I was saying is that when you had the civil war in 2006 and 2007, when you had a country that looked like it was spiraling into chaos, when you had many people leaving, what you have now is a situation where people have decided to try and put the country back together. Whether they'll be successful, we'll have differences of opinion. Iraqis have differences of opinion. I'm not saying it's better off than a specific situation. I'll just say that since 1979, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, Iraq has gone through a series of crises. Many refugees left during the 80s and during the 90s. I'd say since 2003, there have been more refugees who have left. The question is, how do you build a country where people can return? And the Iraqis are going to be the ones that determine this, and we see signs they'll do this. There's enormous challenges, but we see signs that they're trying to put the country back together. So better is a relative term. All I'm saying is that we've had elections, we've had an inclusive government formed where people are participating. There's still enormous challenges, and I mentioned corruption as being probably the biggest one. Please.
You mentioned that you were focused on several items. I never heard the word suicide bombing, which continues at a high rate, maybe accelerating, and can't possibly lead to a stable society.
Okay, and when I didn't talk about our partnership with the military and the Iraqi security forces and how they've gotten better at countering suicide bombers. We've seen a dramatic decline in the number of suicide bombers since 2006, 2007. We've seen efforts made by the Iraqi government to work with their neighbors. I agree when we talked early, the woman's comment about the borders being porous and suicide bombers coming across. These are rejected by suicide bombers are rejected by Iraqi society. A large percentage of the suicide bombers are still foreign fighters. They're people coming from other countries who have no ties to the community and blow themselves up. We believe that the society is rejecting this type of extremism and will continue to resist. These people who are sending forth these suicide bombers are trying to destroy what's going on in Iraq. They'll continue to do that. It is a focus, and the Iraqi security forces work every day to stop them. They're getting better at it every day. Their intelligence networks, their abilities to go after the cells of suicide bombers have dramatically improved. We've been out of the cities. The U.S. forces have been out of Iraq cities since June of 2009. There was some ability of the terrorists to take advantage of that. We think that's gone away now. And you still read about suicide bombing attacks, but, for example, after the attack on the church on October 31st, the Iraqi government took measures to protect those churches. So the extremists then went after Christians in their places of work, then they went after Christians in their homes. Some of the suicide bombings recently have been on Shia pilgrims who walk along for long distances, going to the holy shrines along roads, and it's very difficult to protect them. We think that there are measures being taken to address this, and terrorism is something that I did mention terrorism during my remarks, and we will continue to focus on terrorism because it's what I think that is one of the greatest threats to Iraq's success. I don't think it's the threat it was before. As I said, I think corruption and economic issues are going to be a bigger threat, but I also don't see revolution as the big threat. I may be wrong, but that's where we are. Well, you've already asked one, so let me go.
Could you comment on the partnership with the United States and perhaps the United Nations and others in attempting to achieve what you were earlier discussing to help rebuild Iraq? I mean, are we doing this alone? If you're mentioning you're going before Congress to ask for funding for this. Are we in there alone, or are we in there as the United Nations and other countries sharing those goals?
The United Nations is definitely there with the different wings doing development work, but more importantly working on Arab-Kurd disputes and coming up with sort of mediation efforts. The World Bank is there. The EU, the European Union, or the European Community as it's known now, is there with working with the Iraqis. What's positive now is that the Iraqis are coordinating these efforts themselves. A couple of years ago, there was something called the International Compact for Iraq, and it was meetings held outside of Iraq to raise money to support progress in Iraq. Now those meetings are being held in Iraq, and they're not called the International Compact for Iraq. They're the actual Iraqi ministries meeting with the different aid donors and working out how to best to maximize foreign assistance. So there is a lot of partnership. What we also are working on is seeing that local investment assistance. That's why I said it's very important that relations with Saudi Arabia improve. We think Qatari and Emirati, United Arab Emirates investment is critical to providing the boost for the Iraqi economy. And we think that there's an opportunity for that as we go forward. The Japanese, the South Koreans, the Turks are playing from a private national interest point of view. And the Chinese are all trying to get into the Iraqi market. So there's a lot of people trying to help. The Iraqis are coordinating much better. We see our role to help the Iraqis coordinate this in a way that fights corruption, that is best for their people, they don't get it taken advantage of as this assistance comes in. And we think we have partners to do that, and we think we have a partnership with the Iraqis to do that.
Thank you.
One more question there, and then one more at the back.
Okay. You briefly touched on oil. I think all of us know that economics is going to be the driving force of stability in the future of the country. No matter what effort you put into the politics and structuring and capacity building within the organization, it doesn't matter if the oil revenues don't support the local community. So in terms of helping the international companies being involved there, what are the efforts and what are your points of contact? You can't travel as an American diplomat in Iraq, and the national, provincial oil companies are taking more of a role. What are your points of contact in helping them establish and develop the local capacity and local companies to support the internationals and really develop an infrastructure that can support an economy that can support the locals to do these things that, you know, Iraqis should be doing for themselves?
Well, first of all, we have a consulate in Basra, or it hasn't been officially designated as a consulate, but it used to be what's called a provincial reconstruction or regional reconstruction team. And it is a platform for the oil companies, and more importantly from the U.S., the oil service companies that are servicing all the international oil companies, or the majority of them. They're establishing their own camps there. We're helping with regulations, whether it's visa regulations, whether it's how private security contractors work in Iraq. We have a group of international oil executives that we work with in Iraq. We're encouraging them to support a Chamber of Commerce, for example. We're helping in their relations with the Ministry of Oil. We just had our Energy Secretary, or Deputy Secretary Poneman, who was in Iraq over the weekend. We definitely have lots of contact with the oil industry because we agree with you. We think that a corruption-free, transparent, and equitable distribution of oil resources is key to Iraq's future. So we are engaged in many different ways as the oil companies go forward. I would say that some of these oil companies are very focused on hiring local Iraqis to do their work, both because it makes more sense from security and because it's more efficient, and the local Iraqis don't require the high salaries. I won't mention which companies, but I'll say that certain countries are still in the mode of bringing in their own nationals to do the simplest construction techniques, and that's not very popular with the Iraqis. So this is a give and take with the Iraqis as we go forward. There are regulations. There is a tendency to centralization. There are problems, bureaucratic problems, that the international oil companies face. We hope that as the international oil companies and the U.S., particularly oil service companies, overcome these barriers, other companies and other American companies, we hope, will be able to invest in Iraq and be successful. It's an important market. It always has been an important market. Please.
I was wondering what the situation in Kirkuk was. With the Kurds wanting to expel the Arabs that had been moved in there. Has that calmed down, or they come to accommodation of some kind?
They haven't come to an accommodation yet, but I would refer to the earlier question that I would see that there are signs of compromise on both sides to addressing how to resolve the thorny issue of Kirkuk. And the Provincial Council is having discussions. I was just in Kirkuk 10 days ago on that trip, and we met with the head of the Provincial Council who saw some positive signs and saw ability of maybe compromise as we go forward. But it will be, the Arab-Kurd issues are enormously important as we go forward, and we have to continue. We can't take our eye off that ball. Did you have a question in the front?
Yes, I did. In last elections, how many females were voting in power in government?
In the Council of Representatives, there are females who are there because there are quota seats for females. I don't have. Yeah, there's quota for females. There were supposed to be more female ministers, and Prime Minister Maliki was criticized because his government doesn't have enough female ministers. In the 8 ministers that he named 10 days ago, I think 2 or 3 were women, so they're improving women's representation. I would say that women have been very active in Iraqi society and in Iraqi politics, and under Saddam Hussein, women were a part of Iraqi society. I think that there have been tendencies to that have suggested that women aren't doing as well as they were doing before. We're watching that. There's programs that we operate to address women's rights and women's participation. I think this is going to be something that we will continue to dialogue with the government and pressure the government to do more for women's rights. But I think that a representative government is going to represent women's issues and women's. It's not doing it as fully as that we would like to see it being done. Absolutely.
One more question.
Both of you have asked questions before, so we'll do a short one from each of you, and I'll do that.
Since 2003, all I hear is a sanitized version of really what goes in Iraq, and you address all these terrorists and this and that. But the biggest ones that have committed the war crimes inside Iraq is the United States, and the thousands of Iraqi scientists, professors, and poets, writers, thinkers, they have been gunned down in Iraq by 4 sources. Iraq is fighting 4 wars. One is the United States, 2 is Israeli Mossad, 3 is the Iran. And they all working together, but then they're using local groups as well to kill them. But the 4th one is actually US recruited mercenaries and assassins. While they're leaving the military, they're going over to the mercenaries and they're getting $1,000 a day. And as long as these people are there, there will be no end to the war in Iraq and there will be no normalcy there. And I believe that is something that Obama regime should really look very closely into this thing.
I really don't agree with that comment, but it's not really a question, so please, do you have a question in the back?
So my question for you is maybe something you can't answer, but what is the climate in Washington to actually continue to provide funding for civilian services in Iraq? I would think that's going to be a hard trek.
I think we see that there is, we got a supplemental spending package last summer, which had funding to open our or to start work on our consulates and to start work on our embassy branch offices. I think we see, as the Secretary of State argues, that we shouldn't be penny wise and pound foolish at this late stage. When you think that Department of Defense for last year, and this was as they drew down their troops to 50,000, required $43 billion for Iraq, and we're only asking for $6 billion. You're seeing that the cost to the national budget is, we think, is worth it, especially as you see instability in the region. We see support from both Democrats and Republicans. We had testimony over the last, we had the Senate Armed Service Committee and we had the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where there were good comments from senators on both sides of the House saying how it's important for two things. Both support the State Department, which I think is important because they want to see the civilians succeed in Iraq and to see the military able to leave, and to support a partnership with Iraq so that we don't have to, so Iraq doesn't become a source of instability in the region, but becomes a force for, as President Obama said in his speech in Camp Lejeune in February of 2009, we want to see Iraq be a positive force in the region. As I started out my remarks, in the 1950s, Iraq was a positive source in the region, and we believe it can be again, although it faces enormous challenges. Anyway, it's been a great honor to speak to you. The questions were fantastic, and thank you very, very much. Hey, that was good. Thank you very much. No, thank you for the introduction. Very good. Great to see you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, it was a pleasure. That's good. I told David, make sure he knows that simultaneously.